This happened about a year ago, but thinking about it still sends shivers down my spine. I had just gotten out of a rough relationship, and my friends suggested I try Tinder to meet someone new. After swiping for a few days, I matched with a guy named Jake. He was charming, good-looking, and seemed genuinely interested in our chats. After a week of texting, he suggested we meet up for a coffee. I agreed, and we decided to meet at a local cafe one evening. The date started off really well. Jake was just as charming in person as he was over text, but about halfway through, I started to feel a bit off. Not sick exactly, more like unnerved. Jake's demeanor had changed slightly. His questions started to get more personal, almost invasive. Questions like where exactly I lived, whether I lived alone, and if I usually went out late at night. I tried to redirect the conversation or give vague answers, but he would steer it back. Then he asked something that made my stomach drop. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" I laughed it off, but he didn't laugh. He just stared at me, waiting for an answer. I quickly excused myself to go to the bathroom. When I returned, Jake seemed normal again, and we soon said our goodbyes. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Later that night, I got a series of texts from him. They started out normal, saying he had a great time and hoped to see me again. But then they got weird. He texted, "Why didn't you tell me you had such a nice little apartment?" I froze. I hadn't told him where I lived, let alone invited him over. I asked him what he meant, trying to keep my tone light. He replied, "I just know these things. I can't wait to see you again." I didn't respond. I tried to convince myself it was a bad joke. But over the next few days, things got worse. I started noticing someone lingering near my apartment. I'd see a figure just out of sight every time I went to and from work. Once, I even got a text from Jake right after seeing this figure. "Loved the blue dress today. You should wear it more often." I called the police, but without more to go on, they couldn't do much. They suggested I stay with friends or family for a while. I decided to go to my sister's place in another city for a week. The day I planned to leave, I found a note under my door. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. It read, "Going away? I'll miss you." I was terrified. I left immediately, called the police again, and showed them the note. This time, they took it more seriously. They started an investigation and asked me not to return home until they had more information. They also suggested I delete my Tinder account and any other dating profiles I had. It took a few weeks, but they finally caught him. He was indeed stalking me and several other women he met through Tinder. It turned out Jake wasn't even his real name. He had a history of harassment and had been flagged in other states. I moved back into my apartment eventually, but it took months before I felt safe again. I haven't been back on Tinder since. Every time my phone buzzes with a notification, my heart skips a beat, wondering if somehow, despite everything, he found a way back to me. I'd been using Tinder on and off for a couple of years, but after a string of boring dates, I was about to delete it for good. That's when I matched with Sarah. She was intriguing, not my usual type, but beautiful, and had an air of mystery about her that caught my attention. We chatted for a couple of days and hit it off. She was smart, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in me. We decided to meet up for dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant she suggested. The evening started off great. Sarah was even more captivating in person. We talked about everything from our favorite books to our weirdest dreams. After dinner, she suggested we go for a walk. There was a secluded park not too far from the restaurant, and although it was a bit late and the park was technically closed, she convinced me it would be fun. As we walked through the park, I began to feel uneasy. The park was darker and more isolated than I expected, with barely any streetlights. Sarah seemed to know her way pretty well. leading us through dimly lit pathways and around shadowy corners. I tried to keep the conversation going, but my discomfort must have shown. Suddenly, she stopped walking and turned to face me. Her demeanor had changed. She looked at me intensely, almost piercingly, and asked, "Do you trust me?" Before I could answer, she stepped closer, uncomfortably close, and whispered, "You shouldn't." I was startled and took a step back, trying to laugh it off as a joke. But she didn't laugh. She just stared at me, then turned and continued walking as if nothing had happened. I followed her, now seriously considering making an excuse to leave. As we neared the end of the park, she suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed to a dimly lit bench. "Let's sit for a minute," she said. I hesitated, but didn't want to make a scene. As soon as we sat, she leaned in close and whispered, "I brought you here for a reason." My heart raced. I looked around, but we were completely alone. Before I could react, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old, tattered book. She handed it to me and said, "I want you to have this. Don't read it now. Wait until you're home alone." The book felt heavy in my hands, both physically and metaphorically. I was completely confused and scared, but managed to stammer out that I needed to go. I got up and hurried out of the park, clutching the book. I didn't stop walking until I reached a well-lit street. I glanced back a few times to make sure she wasn't following me. When I got home, I threw the book in a drawer, too unnerved to even look at it. That night, I barely slept. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the book. Inside, I found it wasn't a book at all, but a hollowed-out place holding a single piece of paper. On it was a detailed drawing of the park and two figures on a bench. One was clearly meant to be me, and the other, though blurred, had Sarah's unmistakable features. Underneath the drawing was a date, the very night we were there. I never contacted her again, and she didn't reach out either. I blocked her on Tinder and eventually threw out the book. But sometimes when I pass by a park at night, I can't help but feel like someone is watching me, waiting. The fear of what might have happened if I hadn't left that night still haunts me. It all started when I matched with Alex on Tinder. She was stunning, seemed intelligent, and had an adventurous spirit according to her profile. We hit it off right away, exchanging messages about our hobbies, which surprisingly aligned almost perfectly. We both loved hiking, horror movies, and were both foodies eager to explore local eateries. After a week of texting, we decided to meet up for a late-night hike, which was something we both enjoyed. We met at the trailhead of a popular local hiking spot. It was less crowded at night, and she mentioned loving the peace and the night sounds of the forest. Alex seemed even more vibrant in person, her energy almost infectious. As we walked, she suggested a lesser-known path she said was more scenic and private. The hike was challenging but exhilarating. We talked and laughed, and I was really enjoying her company. When we reached a secluded overlook, she stopped and took out her phone, saying she wanted to take a selfie with me at the scenic spot. I agreed, still riding the high of the perfect night. But as she held up her phone, I noticed she wasn't opening her camera app. She was texting someone. Confused, I asked her who she was texting. She smiled, a strange, unsettling smile, and said, "Oh, just letting a friend know where we are. Safety first, right?" Something about her tone didn't sit right with me. It felt off, like there was a double meaning behind her words. Before I could question her further, her phone pinged with a response. She read the message, laughed softly, and then looked up at me. "My friend is nearby and wants to meet up with us. I hope that's okay." I felt a sudden chill despite the warm night. Everything felt wrong suddenly. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there. I told her I was feeling tired and suggested we head back. She seemed annoyed, but agreed. As we made our way back, I heard rustling in the bushes and footsteps that didn't sync with ours. My heart pounded, and I picked up the pace. Alex kept talking as if nothing was wrong, which made everything feel even more surreal. When we finally got back to the trailhead, I saw a figure standing by the parking lot. It wasn't threatening by itself, but the context made it terrifying. I didn't stop to find out who it was. I said a quick goodbye to Alex and left as quickly as I could. Once in my car, I locked the doors and drove away, my heart still racing. I glanced in my rearview mirror a few times to make sure I wasn't being followed. Later that night, Alex sent me a message. "You left so abruptly. We were just going to have a little fun. Maybe next time?" I didn't respond. I blocked her number and deleted my Tinder account right then and there. I still hike, but never at night and never alone. Sometimes I wonder who was in the woods with us and what might have happened if I had stayed. I had been using Tinder as a way to meet new people after moving to a new city for work. My life was pretty busy, so it seemed like a convenient way to socialize. After a few unremarkable dates, I matched with a woman named Eliza. She was beautiful, with an enchanting smile and an air of mystery that drew me in. We exchanged messages for a few days and found out we had a lot in common. She suggested we meet at a small old bar she claimed was one of the hidden gems of the city. The night we met, the bar was dimly lit and nearly empty, adding to its charm. Eliza was already there, seated in a cozy corner. She greeted me with a warm smile, and the date started wonderfully. We had a great conversation, sharing stories and laughing together. As the night progressed, however, I started to notice something odd. Eliza would occasionally glance towards the entrance as if she was expecting someone. Curious, I finally asked her if she was waiting for someone else. She laughed it off, saying, "No, just an old habit." But her eyes darted back to the entrance one too many times, making me feel uneasy. The mood shifted slightly, and I found myself becoming more alert. Despite this, we continued to talk, and she suggested we have one more drink before leaving. As she went to the bar to order our drinks, I noticed her talking to the bartender for a bit longer than necessary. When she returned, she brought our drinks, and her demeanor had changed. She seemed more intense, more insistent that I drink up. The vibe was off, and my gut told me not to drink what she had brought me. I pretended to drink, holding the glass to my lips, but not actually drinking. Eliza watched me, her gaze sharp. It was then that I truly felt something was wrong. Making up an excuse, I said I needed to use the restroom. Instead of going to the bathroom, I slipped out of the bar's back exit. Once outside, I didn't stop to look back. I walked briskly towards my car, parked a couple of streets over. As I approached, I saw Eliza exiting the bar with two large men, looking around, clearly looking for me. I ducked behind a parked car until they passed. They spoke briefly, seeming frustrated, before heading back towards the bar. Driving home, my mind raced. I realized how little I actually knew about Eliza, and how easily things could have turned bad. I reported her on Tinder, explaining what had happened, but never heard anything about it. I stopped using Tinder after that night, shaken by the realization of how vulnerable I had been. After a string of uneventful Tinder dates, I matched with someone who seemed different. Her name was Mara. She had a quirky sense of humor that matched mine, and our conversation flowed effortlessly. We decided to meet up at a local diner she suggested, saying it was out of the way but worth the trip. The diner was located on the outskirts of town, almost too secluded for a first meeting. When I arrived, Mara was already there, sitting in a booth by the window. She greeted me with a bright smile, and initially, everything felt right. We ordered coffee and talked about our interests. But as the conversation went on, I noticed Mara seemed particularly interested in my past relationships and my current living situation, specifically asking about the level of security in my apartment building. As our conversation deepened, she excused herself to go to the restroom. That's when things took a strange turn. She left her phone on the table and it buzzed with a message. Normally I wouldn't look, but the preview showed something chilling. Is he the one? Will it be tonight? Chills ran down my spine. When Mara returned, I asked her casually who she was texting. She brushed it off as a conversation with her sister, but her demeanor had shifted. She was suddenly more insistent that we go somewhere else after finishing our coffee. She suggested a walk in a nearby wooded area, saying it was a great place to get a feel for nature. Alarm bells rang in my head. I declined and said I needed to head home as it was getting late. Mara seemed frustrated and tried to persuade me, but I stayed firm on my decision. When I stood up to leave, she followed suit, maintaining a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I walked her to her car, a polite gesture, but instead of leaving, I watched as she made a phone call. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught phrases like "not yet" and "going back now." I quickly got into my car and drove out of the parking lot, checking my mirrors to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I got home, I blocked Mara on Tinder and all my social media accounts. I was too shaken to sleep well that night, the what-ifs playing over and over in my mind. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.